Hollywood in the 1950s wasn't just John Wayne and big Technicolor epics. Beneath the blockbuster glare were westerns that critics loved, audiences admired, but studios quietly let fade into the dust. Some were too smart, some too dark, and some just didn't fit the studio's idea of what the Old West should look like. But here's the twist. Many of these so-called forgotten gems are better than the classics you always hear about. Ready to dig up what Hollywood buried? Winchester 73, 1950. It all starts with a rifle. Not just any rifle, but the coveted Winchester 73. A prize that shifts hands in a chain of greed, betrayal, and frontier justice. James Stewart, teaming with director Anthony Mann for the first time, gave us a western that broke away from the glossy, clean-cut cowboys of earlier decades. This film was messy, psychological, and ahead of its time. The story tracks the rifle as it passes from Stewart's driven marksmen to outlaws, traitors, and killers. Every new owner reveals something about the way power corrupts on the frontier. Mann's direction keeps the pace sharp and the tension simmering. The dusty landscapes look authentic, but it's the characters who feel real. Stewart plays Lynn McAdam, a man hunting his brother, and his obsession makes the film feel almost like a noir. At release, it was a risk. Stewart had just come off a string of romantic comedies, and audiences weren't sure he could pull off a hardened cowboy. He not only did it, he reinvented himself. Critics praised the film for blending suspense, violence, and moral weight. Even today, it sits high on rankings of the best westerns ever made. So, why did Hollywood let it fade for decades? Simple. It was too dark for television syndication and too complex for Saturday matinee reruns. Studios favored brighter, simpler westerns. But Winchester 73 still stands tall as a turning point, where the American Western grew up and showed just how sharp it could be. Broken Arrow, 1950. Before Hollywood learned to talk about Native American representation, there was Broken Arrow. James Stewart again, but this time as Tom Jeffords, a white frontiersman who dares to make peace with the Apache leader Cochise, played by Jeff Chandler. In a decade full of cliches and offensive caricatures, this film seriously tried, to tell a different story. Director Delmer Daves crafted a movie that focused on dialogue, trust, and the fragile attempt at reconciliation. The romance between Jeffords and an Apache woman, played by Deborah Paget, was groundbreaking for its time. Sure, it still carried the lens of 50s Hollywood, but it avoided turning Native Americans into faceless villains. Instead, it treated them with dignity, showing a culture with values, honor, and grievances. When it premiered, critics were shocked. Stewart, known for his all-American roles, played a man willing to defy his own people for peace. Chandler earned an Oscar nomination for his portrayal of Cochise, and the movie was hailed as a serious step forward. But here's the catch. Studios quickly moved back to formula. Big money still favored shootouts and cattle drives, not fragile negotiations and social commentary. Broken Arrow ended up buried in the shuffle, remembered mostly by historians and Stewart fans. Yet it deserves more credit. It was one of the first major Hollywood westerns to depict Native Americans as people instead of props. In the landscape of the 1950s, that alone makes it not just notable, but essential. Devil's Doorway, 1950. Anthony Mann again, and this time he pushed even harder. Devil's Doorway tells the story of Lance Poole, a decorated Shoshone veteran who returns home from the Civil War only to face prejudice and betrayal. Played by Robert Taylor, it's a gut punch of a film, stripped of the romantic frontier myths that filled so many westerns of the time. The tragedy here is sharp and direct. Poole owns land, but bigoted townsfolk and corrupt lawmen conspire to take it. What follows is a slow burn of frustration and resistance. The movie doesn't dress things up with sweeping love stories or flashy shootouts. Instead, it focuses on the harsh reality of discrimination, and it's uncomfortable, which is exactly why it works. Mann shot it like a shadowy noir. The black and white photography makes the landscape look unforgiving, and Taylor's performance is haunted, restrained, and unlike anything he'd done before. Critics today see it as one of the boldest westerns of the decade, but back then, MGM hardly promoted it. Why? Because it didn't fit the cheerful post-war image Hollywood wanted to sell. Instead of being remembered as a milestone, it was quietly shelved, overshadowed by lighter, more profitable films. Yet Devil's Doorway has aged into something far more powerful. It doesn't just question the Western myth. It breaks it open. In a way, it's the buried conscience of the 50s Western, and one that deserves every ounce of respect. The Furies, 1950. Imagine a Western where the toughest gunfighter isn't a cowboy, but Barbara Stanwyck. The Furies, directed by Anthony Mann, is part family saga, part Shakespearean drama, and part old-fashioned revenge story. And it's one of the strangest, most fascinating films Hollywood tried to ignore. Stanwyck plays Vance Jeffords, the sharp-witted daughter of a domineering ranch baron, played by Walter Huston in his final role. Instead of the usual cattle drives or gold rush tropes, the conflict here is between father and daughter, land and inheritance, power and betrayal. The story spirals into jealousy, rage, and unforgettable confrontations. What makes it so different is how it mixes melodrama with Western grit. Stanwyck is fierce, manipulative, and magnetic, making her one of the few women in the genre who isn't just a love interest or damsel. Huston, meanwhile, commands the screen with every word, reminding audiences why he was one of Hollywood's greats. The cinematography, all deep shadows and wide skies, only adds to the operatic scale. When it released, critics didn't know what to do with it. Was it a soap opera? A western? A family tragedy? The confusion meant it didn't get the spotlight it deserved. But over time, cinephiles have come to recognize it as a daring experiment that proved westerns could tackle themes bigger than the frontier. The Furies is messy, passionate, and unforgettable, and that's exactly why it belongs on this list. The Gunfighter, 1950, Gregory Peck, with a mustache, staring down destiny. That's The Gunfighter, and it might be the most quietly devastating western of the decade. Peck plays Jimmy Ringo, an aging gunslinger who's grown tired of living on the edge but can't escape his reputation. Everywhere he goes, some young hotshot wants to make a name by challenging him. The genius of this movie is how small it feels. Most of it takes place in a single town, and the tension is built on conversations, stares, and the heavy weight of time. Ringo isn't chasing glory. He's chasing peace, hoping to reconnect with his estranged family. But the myth of the gunfighter is bigger than he is, and it keeps pulling him back. Henry King, directed with restraint, keeping the camera tight and the mood heavy. Peck's performance is weary, dignified, and heartbreaking. Critics praised it at the time, but Fox didn't push it. Why? Because it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of western that sold popcorn by the bucket. Instead, it was a meditation on fame, reputation, and the price of violence. In the years since, filmmakers like Sam Peckinpah and Clint Eastwood have clearly drawn inspiration from it. The Gunfighter proved that a western didn't need endless action to hit hard. Sometimes, all it takes is one man, one town, and the shadow of his past, catching up with him. If you want to see the 50s western at its most thoughtful, this is it. Rawhide, 1951. Not every great western needs sweeping plains or massive cattle drives. Sometimes, all you need is a single station, a handful of people, and the slow burn of fear. That's Rawhide, a tense, stripped-down thriller starring Tyrone Power and Susan Hayward. The setup couldn't be simpler. Power plays a worker at a remote stagecoach stop, expecting another routine day. But the routine ends when outlaws take over, using the station as their hideout after a prison break. Hayward's character, traveling with a child, gets caught in the middle. And suddenly, the quiet stop becomes a powder keg. What makes Rawhide so good is how it feels almost like a play. The tension comes not from spectacle, but from characters trapped together, testing each other's resolve. The villains aren't cartoonish. They're frighteningly human, unpredictable, and dangerous. Hugh Marlowe, playing the leader, is chilling precisely because he never raises his voice. It's all menace, no theatrics. Critics at the time liked it, but studios brushed it aside, favoring bigger, flashier productions. Power, usually cast as a swashbuckler or romantic hero, showed he could dig into darker territory, and Hayward matched him beat for beat with fierce defiance. Today, Rawhide stands out as one of the great bottle westerns, small-scale, but incredibly effective. It proves that the frontier wasn't always about open horizons. Sometimes, the scariest battles happened in the tightest corners. Bend of the River, 1952. James Stewart and Anthony Mann strike again, and this time they gave us Bend of the River, a western that crackles with betrayal, survival, and shifting loyalties. Stewart plays Glenn McClintock, a former outlaw trying to go straight by guiding a wagon train of settlers into Oregon. Along the way, he saves Rock Hudson's character, a slippery drifter who might not be as trustworthy as he seems. This isn't your standard good guy versus bad guy tale. It's about shades of gray, where trust can mean the difference between life and death. The settlers depend on Stewart, but his own past haunts him, and Hudson's unpredictable presence keeps the tension alive. The film builds toward a brutal conflict over supplies, where desperation pushes men to reveal who they really are. Shot against gorgeous Pacific Northwest landscapes, Bend of the River looks epic but plays intimate. Anthony Mann had a knack for exploring human flaws, and Stewart delivers one of his most rugged, layered performances. Hudson, still early in his career, shows flashes of the star he'd become. At the box office, it did fine, but critics didn't treat it with the reverence it deserved. Maybe because it was too cynical for the happy pioneer narrative Hollywood liked to sell. Today, though, many film historians consider it one of the best westerns of the decade. It's a story about redemption, betrayal, and the dangerous bend every man faces when the stakes are life or death. The Naked Spur, 1953. Few westerns dig as deeply into obsession as The Naked Spur. James Stewart, once again under Anthony Mann's sharp direction, plays Howard Kemp, a bounty hunter tracking down a wanted man. On paper, it sounds like a standard pursuit story. In practice, it's one of the most psychologically intense westerns of the 1950s. Stewart's Kemp isn't a noble lawman. He's desperate, bitter, and barely hanging on. He teams up with a mismatched group, a prospector, a dishonored soldier, and the fugitive's companion. And the alliances shift constantly. Every scene feels like someone might betray someone else, and Mann keeps the pressure high. Robert Ryan, as the fugitive, steals scenes with his smooth, manipulative menace. Janet Leigh, in an early dramatic role, adds another layer. Caught between survival and loyalty. The Colorado landscapes are breathtaking, but they're never just pretty backdrops. They underline the harshness of the chase, reminding us how small and fragile people look against nature. Critics loved it, and Stewart even earned an Oscar nomination. But the movie never reached the iconic status of High Noon or Shane. Why? Because it was too raw, too inward-looking, and too unsettling for mass audiences craving heroes. Hollywood preferred its westerns polished, not haunted. The Naked Spur proves that the genre could be as sharp and unforgiving as a thriller. It's not just about who wins the fight, it's about what chasing that fight does to a man's soul. Shane, 1953. Yes, Shane makes the list. You've heard of it, maybe even seen it, but for years Hollywood buried it behind bigger Wayne pictures and glossier epics. Alan Ladd stars as the mysterious drifter who wanders into a Wyoming valley, befriends a family, and reluctantly steps into their struggle against ruthless ranchers. The brilliance of Shane isn't in its plot, which is straightforward, but in its execution. Director George Stevens treated every frame like a painting. The wide landscapes feel both beautiful and lonely, and the tension builds slowly, almost painfully, toward the inevitable showdown. Alan Ladd, not a big man physically, played Shane with a quiet strength that cut through the cliché of the towering cowboy. His relationship with the young boy, played by Brandon DeWilde, gave the movie its heart. And Jack Palance, as the black-clad gunman hired to intimidate the settlers, delivered one of the most chilling villain roles of the decade. When it premiered, audiences loved it, and it scored multiple Oscar nominations. But studios didn't keep pushing it in the years that followed. Why? Because it didn't fit the loud, colorful Western image that dominated television reruns in the 60s. Instead, Shane slipped into the background until film critics resurrected it decades later as one of the greatest Westerns ever made. Its ending, with the boy calling out, "Shane, come back," is one of the most iconic in the genre. Quiet, tragic, and unforgettable, Shane is proof that even buried classics can leave an echo that never fades. The Big Country, 1958. If you want a Western that feels bigger than life, The Big Country delivers. Gregory Peck, Charlton Heston, Gene Simmons, and Burl Ives headline this sprawling epic, directed by William Wyler. On the surface, it's about a sea captain who comes west and gets caught in a feud over water rights. But beneath that, it's really about pride, ego, and the fight between men who can't back down. Peck plays James McKay, a man who refuses to prove himself with violence, frustrating both his fiancée's family and his enemies. Heston smolders as the ranch foreman, while Burl Ives, in an Oscar-winning performance, steals scenes as a fiery patriarch. The landscapes are vast, the score is sweeping, and the drama feels almost Shakespearean. At release, it did well, but critics were divided. Some thought it was too slow, too long, or too talky for a Western. Over time, though, people realized Wyler was doing something radical. Instead of glorifying macho showdowns, he was questioning them. McKay's refusal to fight on someone else's terms became the most powerful statement in the film. But here's the kicker. The Big Country got overshadowed by flashier hits and rarely got rerun on television because of its length. That's why it faded, despite being one of the richest, most ambitious Westerns ever made. Today, it stands tall as a buried treasure, a reminder that the West wasn't always about the fastest draw. Sometimes, the strongest man was the one who chose not to fight. Man of the West, 1958. Gary Cooper was already an icon when he made Man of the West, but this film pushed him into darker, more unsettling territory. Directed by Anthony Mann, it's about Link Jones, a reformed outlaw who finds himself stranded with a group of fellow passengers, only to be captured by the very gang he once rode with. Suddenly, his past isn't behind him, it's staring him in the face. Unlike the noble heroes Cooper often played, Link is deeply conflicted. He's ashamed of where he came from, but knows he can't escape it. The film's villain, played by Lee J. Cobb, is terrifying in his unpredictability, and the gang's cruelty makes the whole story feel like a descent into nightmare. Mann shoots it all with grit and rawness, stripping away the glossy myth of the frontier. When it was released, critics were unsettled. Some thought it was too violent, too bleak, too uncomfortable. It wasn't the kind of Western audiences were used to in the 50s, where heroes wore white hats and rode off into the sunset. Instead, Man of the West exposed the dirt and blood under the myth. Today, many film scholars call it one of the greatest Westerns ever made, with Cooper giving one of his finest late-career performances. But Hollywood never gave it the spotlight, burying it under safer, more palatable fare. If you want to see the genre cracking open, revealing the seeds of the revisionist Westerns that came later, this is the one to watch. The Hanging Tree, 1959. Gary Cooper again, but this time with a role that's even stranger and more ambiguous. The Hanging Tree, directed by Delmer Daves, casts him as Dr. Frail, a frontier doctor with a mysterious past who shows up in a gold rush town. From the start, he's both savior and enigma, a man who heals others but keeps his own secrets locked away. The story shifts when he rescues a woman injured in a stagecoach accident, played by Maria Schell. Their relationship grows complicated, layered with gratitude, suspicion, and quiet longing. Meanwhile, the town around them simmers with greed, envy, and mob mentality. The hanging tree of the title looms as a constant reminder of how quickly justice could turn into vengeance on the frontier. Cooper plays it with stoic intensity, showing vulnerability beneath the gruff exterior. Carl Malden brings fire as the town villain, and a young George C. Scott makes his film debut with a chilling small role. The film doesn't play like a traditional Western, It feels closer to a gothic drama transplanted into the Old West. At release, it drew mixed reactions. Too odd, too slow, too morally complicated. But over time, its reputation has grown, and today it's regarded as one of Cooper's boldest films. The Hanging Tree shows that the West wasn't always about open horizons. Sometimes, it was about the shadows we carry inside ourselves. Warlock, 1959. What happens when the men hired to enforce law and order become just as dangerous as the outlaws? That's the question at the heart of Warlock, a layered, underappreciated gem, starring Henry Fonda, Richard Widmark, and Anthony Quinn. Fonda plays Clay Blaisdell, a professional peacekeeper hired to clean up a lawless town. But instead of being a straightforward hero, Blaisdell is charming, cold, and unsettlingly ruthless. He brings order, but at the cost of freedom. And soon, the town realizes they've traded one threat for another. Widmark, as the local who resists him, becomes the moral center, while Quinn adds depth as Blaisdell's loyal but conflicted partner. The film's strength lies in its moral ambiguity. Nobody is purely good or evil. It's all shades of gray. And the tension comes from watching these men test each other's boundaries. Director Edward Dmytryk stages it with elegance, but never lets it feel safe or comfortable. Audiences in 1959 didn't quite know what to make of it. It lacked the clear hero versus villain dynamic that had defined the genre for decades. As a result, it slipped into obscurity. But looking back, Warlock feels decades ahead of its time, anticipating the morally complex anti-heroes of later westerns. If you're tired of black and white morality in the Old West, this buried classic proves that even in the 50s, Hollywood knew how to muddy the waters in the best way. Ride Lonesome, 1959. Randolph Scott had been making westerns for decades, but his partnership with director Bud Boetticher in the late 50s turned into something special. Ride Lonesome is one of their finest, a lean, stripped-down story about a bounty hunter escorting a wanted man across dangerous territory. On the surface, it's simple. But underneath, it's loaded with tension, betrayal, and regret. Scott plays Ben Brigade, a man who seems stoic and professional, but whose mission hides a personal vendetta. Along the way, he crosses paths with drifters, outlaws, and a widow caught in the middle. Every character brings their own motives, and the question becomes not just whether Brigade will succeed, but what success even means for him. Boetticher shot it with spare precision. No wasted scenes, no unnecessary subplots. Just wide desert landscapes, tense standoffs, and characters who feel like they're carrying whole histories behind their eyes. The film runs short, but it lingers long after it ends. At the time, it was just another low-budget western, overshadowed by bigger productions. But over the years, Ride Lonesome has grown into a cult favorite, admired by filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino for its purity and intensity. It's proof that sometimes the smaller films carry the sharpest punch. Buried in its own decade, Ride Lonesome is now seen as one of the essential late 50s westerns, a masterclass in how to do more with less. The Wonderful Country, 1959. Robert Mitchum had a reputation for playing men who lived on the edge, and The Wonderful Country fits that mold perfectly. Here, he plays Martin Brady, an American gunman who flees to Mexico and spends years working for a local warlord. When he tries to return to the United States, he finds himself caught between two worlds, mistrusted by both, belonging to neither. The film is unusual for its time. Instead of focusing on simple frontier battles, it explores identity, loyalty, and exile. Mitchum plays Brady with quiet intensity, showing both toughness and vulnerability. The supporting cast includes Julie London as a lonely officer's wife and Pedro Armendariz as a Mexican general, both of whom complicate Brady's choices. Shot on location in Mexico, the film has a vivid authenticity. The landscapes are vast and unforgiving, underscoring Brady's isolation. Director Robert Parrish keeps the pace deliberate, letting the story breathe, and that makes the emotional beats hit harder. When it came out, audiences didn't flock to it. It lacked the action-packed thrills of other 50s westerns, and its introspective tone didn't fit the era's appetite. So Hollywood quietly let it vanish. But critics who revisit it today see it as a thoughtful, underrated classic. The Wonderful Country is more than just a Western. It's a story about belonging, about searching for a home in a world that keeps pushing you out. And, like its main character, it's been forgotten for too long. So there you have it. 15 of the highest-rated Westerns from the 1950s that Hollywood buried under bigger, louder, flashier titles. Some were too bold, some too complex, and some just didn't fit the myth the studios wanted to sell. But every one of them left a mark, reshaping the genre in ways that echo even now. Which of these buried gems do you think deserves a modern spotlight? Drop your thoughts, hit like, and subscribe for more forgotten legends of film history.